When Mark and Colin found out they were going to have a baby girl, they could never have foreseen that their overwhelming joy would soon transform into deep heartbreak. Imagine being in a situation where your child's life hangs in the balance, and every choice you make could potentially alter everything. This narrative of love, loss, and resilience will challenge your perception of hope when faced with tragedy. Subscribe now to explore more touching stories that will resonate with your heart and uplift your spirit. Mark and Colin had always envisioned themselves as parents, their lives filled with affection, laughter, and dreams for the future. The thrill of discovering that Colin was pregnant with their first child was unparalleled, radiating joy like sunshine piercing through dark clouds, illuminating their lives with endless possibilities. From the moment the pregnancy test revealed 2 pink lines, their journey filled with excitement began. Colin, known for her meticulous nature, eagerly immersed herself in researching every aspect of pregnancy, while Mark, who had a more relaxed demeanor, playfully joked about potential baby names and even began putting together nursery furniture well before they learned whether they were having a boy or a girl. They worked harmoniously as a team, enhancing each other's strengths, and the love they felt for their unborn baby was already immeasurable. At the 18-week mark, it was finally time for the long-awaited gender reveal ultrasound. As they entered the clinic, Mark couldn't contain his happiness and teased Colin about whether they would decorate the nursery in pink or blue. The ultrasound technician appeared cheerful at the outset, highlighting the baby's developing features and verifying they were indeed expecting a girl. "It's a girl!" Mark shouted, gripping Kane's hand tightly. Their eyes lit up with happiness as they envisioned all the small moments that awaited them with their daughter. However, the technician's expression shifted suddenly. His cheerful attitude disappeared, replaced by a serious look of concern. He apologized and stepped out of the room, leaving Mark and Kane exchanging puzzled glances. Moments later, a doctor entered, his face somber. "We need to talk about something we discovered during the scan," he said, gesturing for them to follow him into his office. The warmth and excitement that had filled the room just a short while ago vanished, replaced by a chilling sense of dread. As they walked toward the office, Mark held Kane's trembling hand, both of their hearts racing. The doctor got straight to the point without trying to soften the news. He informed them that their baby had been diagnosed with encephalocele, a rare and severe neural tube defect where the skull does not develop fully during fetal growth. Because of this condition, a significant part of their baby's brain tissue was protruding into a fluid-filled sac outside of her skull. Kane gasped, her breath hitching in her throat as she turned to look at Mark, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief. "What does this mean?" she managed to whisper. The doctor's tone remained steady but grave. He explained that in most cases, babies with this condition do not survive past the first trimester. Miraculously, their daughter had already surpassed that milestone, yet the outlook was still bleak. If she were to reach full term, it was likely that she would experience severe cognitive delays and physical disabilities. There was also a high risk of life-threatening complications. Complications arose, and the words felt sharp and painful like daggers. Alan's thoughts raced as she struggled to comprehend the gravity of the situation they were facing. Tears flowed down her face as she implored the doctor, asking if there was any possible treatment available. The doctor paused before responding, stating that, regrettably, there was no way to rectify the problem while still in the womb. He explained that they needed to decide whether to carry on with the pregnancy or terminate it. He acknowledged how incredibly challenging this choice was, and advised them to think carefully about every aspect before making a decision. The atmosphere in the room became heavy with silence, the burden of the decision weighing heavily upon them like a solid stone. Kaun buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably, while Mark remained motionless, staring vacantly at the floor. That evening, their once joyful home was engulfed by an unbearable quiet. Kaun sat on the couch, her complexion pale and tear-streaked, while Mark moved restlessly around the room, his thoughts swirling chaotically. Finally, Kale broke the silence, her voice cracking as she cried out, questioning what they had done to deserve such a fate, and how they could possibly bring their child into a world where she would inevitably suffer. Mark paused his pacing and knelt down in front of her, taking a moment to gather himself before responding. Holding her hands in his, he gently confessed, "I don't have all the solutions." However, he continued with conviction, "What I do know is that she is our daughter. She's already fighting to stay with us. Perhaps we owe it to her to fight for her as well." Calne shook her head, tears streaming down her face with increasing intensity. "I'm frightened, Mark. I'm so frightened," he responded, revealing his own trembling voice. "So am I, but I have in a tender moment." He held her hands and expressed softly that while he didn't have all the solutions, one thing was certain: their daughter belonged to them. She was already putting up a brave fight to stay with them, and perhaps they owed it to her to also battle for her survival. Calne, overwhelmed with emotion, shook her head as tears streamed down her face, expressing her deep fears to Mark. "I'm terrified, Mark. I really am," she confessed. He admitted he felt the same way, his voice quivering slightly, but he insisted he had faith in their daughter and in their united strength. Even if there was a tiny possibility for her to make it through, he was determined not to give up on her. Over the next few days, both Mark and Calne grappled with their anxieties and uncertainties. Kin found herself awake at night, consumed by research on unveil, feeling increasingly hopeless with each heartbreaking story she encountered. On the other hand, Mark refused to succumb to despair. He immersed himself in online forums and support groups, fervently searching for inspiring tales of survival. It was during this quest that he discovered a post from a mother whose child had triumphed over Cephosile and was now leading a life that resembled normalcy. Although the child faced ongoing hurdles, the fact that they were alive brought Mark a glimmer of hope. He eagerly shared the post with Calne, his voice brimming with cautious optimism, pointing out the encouraging details. It is conceivable, although unusual, for Calne to have read the post. As tears blurred her vision, she encountered words that sparked a glimmer of hope within her for the first time in several days. Perhaps, she whispered gently, this was meant to be their miracle. Together, they resolved to proceed with the pregnancy, a choice rooted in love, fear, and an unshakable belief that their daughter could overcome the challenges ahead. However, as time passed from days into weeks, the gravity of their decision increasingly became evident. Calne faced significant physical challenges associated with her pregnancy, with each kick and movement from the baby serving as a poignant reminder of the delicate life developing inside her. Meanwhile, Mark, eager to present a facade of strength, secretly battled his own anxieties, questioning if he was preparing them all for inevitable heartbreak. Despite the uncertainty surrounding their situation, they channeled their love into getting ready for their daughter's arrival. They painted the nursery a gentle pink, hung tiny clothes in the closet, and selected the name Lincoln, a name they believed would represent fortitude and perseverance. Calne tried to concentrate on the small joys, such as feeling Lincoln's hiccups or listening to her heartbeat during checkups. Still, the heavy shadow cast by the diagnosis loomed large over every moment. As the day of Lincoln's birth approached, it brought along a blend of eagerness and trepidation. In the quiet hours of the night, Calne would lie awake with her hand resting on her belly, silently invoking a miracle. Mark often discovered her in the nursery, seated in the rocking chair, gazing at the vacant crib. He would join her, holding her hand, and together they would nurture the fragile hope that their daughter's journey was not yet concluded. Yet deep down, both understood that the most challenging moments lay ahead. After Lincoln's diagnosis, Mark and his family experienced a whirlwind of mixed emotions. Each day brought new feelings of uncertainty, fear, and occasional glimmers of hope. The ultrasound images of their baby girl, which had once filled them with uncontainable joy, now lay on the coffee table, serving as a solemn reminder of the potential loss they faced. Callan spent her days fluctuating between sorrow and research. She delved into medical journals in an effort to comprehend every aspect of encephalopathy. This condition felt like an overwhelming adversary, its very name sending chills down her spine. On the other hand, Mark was resolute in his role as the family's source of strength, even though his own doubts loomed over him like a storm cloud. One particular evening, Callan found herself alone in the nursery, surrounded by soft pink walls illuminated by the gentle light of a night lamp. She picked up a small onesie and held it close to her heart, tears silently streaming down her cheeks as she whispered to herself, questioning how she could prepare for their daughter without knowing if she would survive. Her voice trembled under the weight of her anguish. Mark entered the room quietly, attuned to her distress, and sat beside her on the floor without uttering a word, placing his arm around her shoulders. "I know this is difficult," he said gently, his tone calm yet laced with sorrow. "But we can't lose hope for her just yet." Callan looked up at him, her eyes puffy and red from crying. "What if we're just extending her suffering? What if this is all about us and not her?" Her voice shook as she expressed the fears that had been haunting her. Mark paused to collect his thoughts before responding. "Callan, I've contemplated that too many times to count, but I always return to one simple truth. She's fighting. Now that she is alive, she is fighting fiercely to remain with us. If she hasn't given up, how can we?" These words resonated deeply within Callan, yet she felt conflicted. She wished to have faith in Lincoln's resilience, but the thought of seeing her child endure pain was nearly unbearable. As she held the tiny onesie, she traced the delicate embroidered hearts with her fingers and softly admitted, "I'm not sure I'm strong enough for this." Mark gently lifted her chin so she would look into his eyes and reassured her, "You don't have to bear this strength by yourself. We will face it together, taking it one step at a time." The following morning, Mark revealed something significant he had discovered during his sleepless nights of research. He had become a member of a Facebook support group aimed at parents whose children are diagnosed with similar conditions. It was there that he came across a post from a mother named Lisa. Her daughter had also been diagnosed with the same illness, but had managed to survive against all odds. Despite facing various obstacles, Lisa's daughter was thriving in her own unique way. Mark shared this post with Callan, his voice filled with hope as he encouraged her. "You need to read this," handing her his phone. "The focus is primarily on survival. It's about discovering ways to live despite the obstacles encountered along the way." As Callan perused the post, she felt a transformation within herself. The story of the mother was incredibly candid and heartfelt, filled with both sorrowful and triumphant moments. She detailed the challenges her family endured, but also expressed the joy of witnessing her daughter take her initial steps, laugh for the first time, and embrace a life brimming with love. After days of feeling despondent, Callan experienced a spark of optimism. "What if Lincoln is like her?" she mused, her voice barely audible. "What if she becomes one of those who succeed?" Mark agreed, his heart swelling with a sense of reassurance. "Exactly. We won't know unless we give her that opportunity." That night, as they lay in bed, they clasped hands and discussed their daughter's future. For every concern they expressed, they attempted to match it with a vision of hope. They envisioned milestones such as her first birthday, her first day at school, and even her wedding day. These thoughts felt delicate, as if they could break apart at any moment, but they chose to embrace them nonetheless. Ultimately, after days filled with deep contemplation, Mark and Callan reached a conclusion: they would take a decisive step forward. Continuing the pregnancy to advocate for Lincoln's life was not a hasty decision. It was a significant leap of faith, stemming from deep love and a strong commitment to their daughter. They understood that the journey ahead would be arduous and fraught with uncertainties, yet they were resolved to face it together. During their next appointment with the doctor, emotions were mixed. Callan's obstetrician, Dr. Patel, was compassionate and experienced. but even she seemed uncertain about the couple's decision. She cautioned them that this path would be challenging, but assured them that if that was their choice, she would do everything possible to assist them. Dr. Patel arranged for regular ultrasounds to keep track of Lincoln's development and well-being. Each appointment brought both blessings and burdens. Hearing Lincoln's heartbeat provided immense comfort, yet the ongoing reminders of the difficulties ahead weighed heavily on their hearts. One afternoon, while Callan rested, Mark took the initiative to start preparing the nursery. He painted a mural depicting a bright blue sky adorned with fluffy white clouds on one wall, hoping it would offer Lincoln tranquility and solace. When Callan entered and saw his creation, she couldn't help but smile through her tears, expressing how beautiful it was and believing that Lincoln would cherish it. As weeks turned into months, Callan and Mark devoted themselves to getting ready for Lincoln's arrival. They hosted a baby shower, surrounded by friends and family who rallied behind their decision, even though some didn't fully comprehend it. Callan's mother, who had initially doubted their choice, began to change her perspective as she observed her daughter's steadfast resolve. One evening, she remarked, "She is fortunate to have you two as her parents." Embracing their child tightly, both Mark and Callan were already in the midst of advocating for her well-being. However, not everyone around them was supportive of their choice. Some individuals who were merely acquaintances raised doubts about their decision, whispering disparaging remarks when they thought they were out of earshot. One person even questioned, "Why would you choose to bring a child into this world only to let her suffer?" This comment was made without considering that Callan could overhear, causing pain to both her and Mark. Despite these hurtful words, they reassured themselves about their choice. It wasn't about denying the obstacles ahead or pretending that everything would be without difficulty. Rather, it was about offering Lincoln an opportunity at life. Regardless of what challenges lay ahead, they wanted her to feel an immense amount of love. As Callan's due date drew near, the weight of their decision became increasingly heavy on her shoulders. Many nights, she found herself unable to sleep, resting her hand on her belly and feeling Lincoln's gentle movements. "Stay strong, little one," she would softly say, reminding herself and her unborn daughter that they were eagerly awaiting her arrival. Mark, ever the optimist, made efforts to uplift her spirits during this time. He read bedtime stories aloud to Lincoln, his rich voice echoing warmth and affection throughout the room. This routine transformed into a nightly bonding experience with their daughter, even before her birth. Yet, despite their attempts to remain upbeat, a sense of fear persisted and anxiety about the uncertain future they would face once Lincoln was born. They understood that the most challenging times were still ahead, but one thing was clear: they would tackle everything together. The wait for Lincoln's arrival was a whirlwind of emotions for both Mark and Callan. Each day that passed brought them closer to the significant moment they had been preparing for, yet it also intensified their fears. In her quieter moments, Callan couldn't shake off the anxiety that gnawed at her heart, even while she lovingly folded tiny pink garments and restructured the nursery in anticipation of their new life. In the nursery, for what felt like the 100th time, Callan's due date was originally scheduled for the 40th week. However, as she approached 38 weeks, everything changed drastically. It was a peaceful evening. Callan had just finished her dinner and comfortably settled on the couch, her hands gently cradling her swollen belly. She could feel the reassuring kicks from Lincoln, a sign that her baby was still resiliently fighting alongside her. Meanwhile, Mark was in the nursery applying the final touches to a mobile he had crafted by hand, adorned with small stars and moons that would delicately sway above Lincoln's crib. Suddenly, a sharp pain surged through Callan's abdomen. This sudden discomfort made her gasp, prompting her to call out, "Mark!" while clutching her belly. The worry evident in her voice compelled him to rush to her side. "What's wrong?" he asked as he knelt beside her, his gaze shifting between her pale face tense with pain and her hands pressed firmly against her stomach. I think it's happening," Callan managed to say through clenched teeth, as another contraction struck, this one more intense than the last. Without hesitation, Mark grabbed the hospital bag they had prepared weeks earlier and assisted Callan into the car. The journey to the hospital seemed to stretch on forever, with every red light intensifying their anxiety about reaching medical care. Mark frequently glanced at Callan, who was gripping the seatbelt tightly and taking rapid, shallow breaths. "It's going to be okay," he reassured her, despite his own voice quaking with doubt. Upon their arrival at the hospital, the medical team was already prepared for them. Dr. Patel, who had been overseeing Callan's pregnancy, greeted them with a composed but serious expression. "We've got you, Callan," she comforted, directing the team to set up for an emergency C-section as Callan was wheeled into the operating room. As Mark's hand slipped away from Callan's, he found himself standing alone in the hallway. The overwhelming sense of emptiness engulfed him like a massive tidal wave. For the first time, he truly comprehended how powerless he was in this situation. All he could do now was wait and hope for the best. Inside the operating room, Callan felt her heart racing as the doctors worked diligently around her. The bright lights above and the sound of various machines created an atmosphere that seemed almost dreamlike. She focused on the image of Lincoln, picturing her tiny face, vowing to herself that she would be strong for her daughter. After what seemed like an eternity, a small, delicate cry broke through the air. It was faint, barely audible, but it was unmistakable. Tears streamed down Callan's face as she softly exclaimed, "She's here. She's really here." However, that moment of joy was short-lived, as Lincoln was quickly taken away by a team of neonatal specialists. Callan barely caught a glimpse of her baby before they disappeared behind the doors, leaving her with a mix of relief and deep sorrow. She had longed to meet her daughter for months, and now, just when she finally did, the baby's future remained uncertain. Mark, anxiously waiting in the hallway, jumped to his feet as soon as he saw a nurse coming out. "Stabilized and is in the NICU," she informed him. "You'll be able to see her soon." He immediately asked, "Is Callan okay?" The nurse reassured him, "She's doing well and will be moved to recovery shortly." A wave of relief washed over him momentarily, but it quickly dissipated as the reality of Lincoln's condition loomed heavily in his thoughts. He followed the nurse to the NICU, and when he arrived at the incubator where Lincoln lay, he was struck speechless. She appeared so small and fragile, with tubes and wires attached to her tiny body. The back of her head was covered in gauze to safeguard the bulge created by the encephalocele. Despite the abundance of medical apparatus around, Mark's area at the back of her head was carefully covered in gauze to protect the bulge caused by the encephalocele. Despite all the medical apparatus surrounding, the situation was critical as there was a significant risk of excessive blood loss due to the infection or complications that might arise during the surgery. Immediate action was necessary, because delaying would increase the chance of her developing serious infections. Kin and Mark exchanged glances, silently acknowledging their mutual fears, which were clearly visible in their expressions. Mark, though calm, spoke with deep emotion when he inquired about her survival odds. Dr. Adams paused briefly before responding, explaining that while proceeding with the surgery could potentially enhance her quality of life, there remained a risk that she might not survive the procedure. A heavy silence enveloped the room, making the weight of their decision feel almost overwhelming. Callan felt tears rolling down her cheeks as she held onto Mark's hand tightly. "What should we do?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. Mark grasped her hand firmly, his own eyes shimmering with unshed tears, and declared resolutely, "We fight. We have come this far. We owe it to her to give it a shot." Later that evening, they sat beside Lincoln's incubator, and Callan leaned down to kiss her daughter's forehead, whispering, "You are stronger than anyone realizes, little one, and so are we." The resolution had been reached. Lincoln's surgery was scheduled for 3 days later, marking the beginning of a new chapter in their journey. Although the decision to go ahead with Lincoln's surgery had been made, the days leading up to it felt like an endless stretch of time. Mark and Callan were determined to spend every single moment at Lincoln's side, engaging with her through conversation, gently singing lullabies, and praying fervently for her strength. The Neonatal Intensive Care Unit, NICU, became their second home, a place where hope and fear intertwined, with each beep coming from the monitors that surrounded Lincoln's fragile form. On the night before the surgery, sleep eluded Callan as she sat next to Lincoln's incubator, her gaze fixed on the rhythmic rise and fall of her daughter's chest. The room was softly illuminated, and the gentle sound of medical equipment filled the air as Callan leaned over her daughter's incubator. She reached her hand through the small opening, lightly touching Lincoln's fragile fingers. "You are so resilient, my little warrior," she murmured. "You've already overcome so much. I wish there was more I could do for you. I wish I could switch places with you." As tears began to stream down her face, her voice faltered. "I don't know what tomorrow holds, but it's essential for you to understand how deeply I love you." Mark, who had been quietly observing from the doorway, approached and knelt beside her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "She knows, Callan," he said softly. "Every word you say, every touch she feels, she understands. You are her mother, and she is aware of that." Callan turned to him, her expression revealing both anguish and gratitude. "What if tomorrow is the last time we see her?" she whispered anxiously. "What if she doesn't survive?" Mark swallowed hard, his throat tightening with emotion. "I don't have the answer," he admitted, his voice shaky. "But we've done everything possible for her, and regardless of what happens, we'll face it together." The moment for surgery came much sooner than anticipated. Lincoln was prepared and then transported into the operating room, her small frame overshadowed by the large medical instruments surrounding her. Kin and Mark followed as close as they could, their hands tightly intertwined. When the doors to the operating room shut, Helen experienced an intense feeling of emptiness. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We wait," Mark responded, guiding her to the waiting area, "and we pray." The waiting room felt stark and frigid, its clinical white walls providing no sense of comfort. Kin sat beside her with her hands tightly clenched in her lap, her gaze fixed on the clock, as if trying to will the minute hand to move faster. Meanwhile, Mark paced back and forth, each footstep echoing in the silence of the room. An hour went by, then two. The minutes dragged on interminably, each second pushing their nerves closer to a breaking point. Callan's mind raced with thoughts of the risks that the surgeon had mentioned: excessive blood loss, infection, and the potential complications that could jeopardize their daughter's life during the procedure. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the doors to the waiting room swung open. Dr. Adams entered with his surgical mask pulled down, revealing a tired yet comforting smile. Callan and Mark sprang to their feet, their hearts racing in anticipation. "The surgery was a success," Dr. Adams declared. "Lincoln is stable and in recovery. We managed to remove the Enco seal and repair the defect. She's a fighter, just like her parents." At that moment, Kin's legs gave way beneath her, and Mark quickly caught her before she could collapse. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she clung to him, relief flooding over her like a powerful wave. "She made it," she whispered, almost unable to believe it. "She really made it." Mark embraced her tightly. As she wiped away her own tears, he remarked on her strength, claiming that she surpassed all of them put together, his voice heavy with emotion. Dr. Adams carried on cautiously, yet with a glimmer of hope, explaining that while the surgery had been successful, Lincoln's journey was not complete. There remained the possibility of infection, and they would need to keep a close watch for any complications. Additionally, there were concerns about possible developmental delays resulting from the part of her brain that had been taken out. However, for the moment, she was doing well, Callan and Mark nodded, taking in every detail. Feeling joy at Lincoln's survival mingled with the awareness that her fight was not finished. In that instant, they permitted themselves to revel in the triumph for which they had labored so fiercely. When they first saw Lincoln after the operation, their hearts filled with both wonder and sadness. Her small head was swathed in layers of gauze, and she was still attached to numerous tubes and monitors. Yet, there was an air of tranquility surrounding her, as though she understood that she had emerged victorious from her struggle. Leaning over the crib, Callan gently caressed Lincoln's cheek, softly saying, "You did it, baby girl," her voice brimming with pride. "You are so brave." Mark stood next to her, his gaze fixed intently on Lincoln, quietly exclaiming, "She's incredible. I can hardly believe how strong she is." In the following days, Lincoln's condition continued to stabilize. The doctors expressed satisfaction with her recovery, and the chances of immediate complications began to lessen. For the first time in several weeks, Callan and Mark felt a bit of relief. Yet, as Dr. Adams had cautioned, the road ahead was still long, as Lincoln would face obstacles in the future due to the portion of her brain that had been removed. The brain that had been surgically removed could potentially impact her ability to move, think, and perceive sensory information. Kin couldn't help but ponder the implications this would have on Lincoln's future. One evening, while they were seated beside Lincoln's crib, Kin expressed her concerns. She wondered aloud whether their daughter would ever be able to walk or talk, or if she would be capable of doing the same things as other children. Mark gently took her hand, his expression a mixture of compassion and determination. He assured her that they would support her throughout her life, providing her with the best possible life regardless of the circumstances. Kin found solace in Mark's words and nodded in agreement. She reminded herself that Lincoln had already beaten the odds once, suggesting that perhaps she might surprise them again. As days transitioned into weeks, Lincoln's recovery progressed, and each small achievement felt miraculous to them. Her first cry after the surgery, her initial effort to grip Mark's finger. These milestones were celebrated by Kin and Mark, emphasizing how their familial bond strengthened with each passing day. However, the uncertainty of what lay ahead cast a shadow over their joy. They understood that the path forward would likely hold difficulties, and the potential for further complications loomed ominously. Despite this, they consciously chose to live in the moment, treasuring every instant spent with their daughter. One peaceful night, as Kin rocked Lincoln to sleep, she softly promised her baby girl that no matter what challenges arose, they would always be there to advocate for her, ensuring she would never feel isolated. Mark, who stood in the doorway, smiled at the tender scene of his wife and child, realizing that although their journey was far from complete, they possessed hope, and that was sufficient for the time being. Lincoln's recovery was indeed remarkable. Daily, Mark and Kin were filled with amazement as their daughter continued to defy expectations. As time went on, Lincoln's small hands began to move with more intent, and she started to keep her eyes open for longer periods, blinking at the surroundings. Each smile, coo, and flutter of her fingers felt like a significant victory. The hospital staff also began to take notice of Lincoln's improvements. Nurses who had encountered numerous cases of brain injuries couldn't resist stopping by her crib to see how she was doing. "She's a warrior," said one nurse, smiling as she adjusted the blanket around Lincoln. "You've got a truly remarkable daughter here." Mark and Callan felt immense pride, even though the uncertainty about what lay ahead still loomed over them. Dr. Adams consistently reminded them about the possible developmental issues that Lincoln could encounter down the road. During one of their meetings, he stated, "She's doing exceptionally well at this point," but he cautioned that the part of her brain that had been removed might affect her balance, coordination, and cognitive skills. He added that it was too early to predict how significant these challenges might be. Callan listened intently, trying to absorb everything he was saying, all while feeling a turmoil within herself. Her heart sank at the thought of her daughter struggling to meet milestones that other children seemed to reach effortlessly. Nevertheless, she reassured herself that Lincoln had already demonstrated her ability to achieve remarkable things. If anyone could defy the odds, it would be her little girl. After several weeks in the hospital, the moment finally arrived when Lincoln was ready to go home. Mark and Callan were filled with a blend of excitement and anxiety as they gathered her belongings. The NICU had become an unusual kind of haven for them, a place where Lincoln had received care from a team of skilled professionals. Bringing her home meant venturing into uncharted territory, but they were ready to embrace that challenge. Finally, it signified the long-awaited moment of having their daughter in their arms, where she truly belonged. As they exited the hospital, Kin held Lincoln lovingly, her eyes filled with tears of happiness. "Welcome home, sweetheart," she whispered gently as they stepped into the light of day. Mark carried the car seat and looked at Kin with a smile that barely concealed the tears welling up in his own eyes. "This is the beginning of something new," he said quietly. The ride back home was serene, marked only by Lincoln's soft breathing and the occasional sound of the engine humming. When they arrived, Mark brought the car seat into the nursery, which had been thoughtfully prepared for Lincoln's arrival. The room, adorned with a sky mural, soft pink walls, and an intricate mobile, radiated a sense of serenity. Kin carefully placed Lincoln in the crib for the first time, and seeing her tiny daughter nestled among the cozy blankets made Kin's throat tighten with emotion. "We've been waiting for this moment," she spoke, her voice shaking slightly. Standing behind her, Mark placed his hands on her shoulders and reassured her, "She's here, Kin. That's all that matters." In the days that followed, their lives transformed into a new kind of busy. Lincoln needed constant attention, from monitoring her temperature to keeping her incision clean. Kin diligently adhered to the doctor's orders, meticulously sterilizing everything and consistently checking Lincoln's vitals like clockwork. Meanwhile, Mark took on the supportive role, managing errands, preparing meals, and stepping in whenever Kin needed a break. Despite the numerous challenges, there were also moments of sheer happiness. One afternoon, while rocking Lincoln in the nursery, Kin heard the baby let out her very first giggle, a sound that filled the room with pure joy. So unexpected that Kin felt a rush of joy, her heart swelling at the sight of Mark. "Mark!" she called out, tears streaming down her cheeks as she left. Mark hurried in, his face brightening upon hearing the gentle melodic sound. "That's our girl," he exclaimed, bending down to plant a kiss on Lincoln's forehead. "She is full of surprises," he remarked. Each small achievement rekindled hope within them. Lincoln began to follow movements with her eyes, reach for toys with her tiny hands, and respond to her parents' voices. Every milestone, no matter how minor, felt like a significant triumph. They celebrated each one as if it were the greatest accomplishment imaginable. However, despite their efforts to remain focused on the present, the reality of Lincoln's condition cast a long shadow over their happiness. Kin couldn't shake off the nagging feeling that something was amiss. She noticed subtle signs indicating that Lincoln's movements were occasionally uncoordinated, and she seemed to struggle with specific reflexes. Although the doctors had informed them about these potential issues, witnessing them manifest in real life served as a painful reminder of the obstacles that awaited them. One evening, while Kin was preparing Lincoln's bottle, Mark entered the kitchen with a worried look on his face. "I've been researching early therapies," he said, presenting a stack of printed articles. "There's a program nearby that focuses on developmental delays. Perhaps we should consider it." Kin set the bottle down on the counter and turned to him. "Do you think she's already lagging behind?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. Mark paused before answering. "I believe she's doing wonderfully, but if there's anything we can do to support her, we definitely should." Kin nodded, grateful for his hopeful perspective even as her worries lingered. Callan's own anxieties were evident as she softly expressed her desire, for her daughter to have every possible opportunity in life. As they diligently worked to establish a safe and nurturing environment for Lincoln, they began to sense a return to normalcy. However, just when they felt a moment of relief, an unexpected turn of events disrupted their fragile tranquility. One evening, Ken observed that Lincoln seemed to have a higher than usual body temperature. Her cries were faint and strained, and her skin appeared flushed. Alarm bells began ringing in Callan's mind as she hurriedly checked her daughter's temperature, realizing it was alarmingly elevated. "Mark!" she called out, panic creeping into her voice. "Something is wrong. We need to get her to the hospital." Without any hesitation, Mark snatched the car keys while Callan quickly wrapped Lincoln in a blanket. The journey to the emergency room felt like a whirlwind filled with dread and silent pleas. Callan held Lincoln close, gently whispering words of encouragement, begging her to hold on. Upon arriving at the hospital, the medical team sprang into action, hastily taking Lincoln into an examination room, leaving Mark and Callan anxiously waiting in the hallway, their hearts racing. Dr. Adams, who had been closely monitoring Lincoln's condition, arrived shortly after. "She has a fever, and her symptoms indicate an infection," he said, in an urgent yet calm manner. "We're conducting tests now to identify the cause." Callan felt her legs weaken as she leaned against the wall for support. Mark wrapped his arm around her, trying to provide comfort as well as stability. "What does this mean?" he asked in a barely audible whisper. Dr. Adams paused before responding, explaining, "It could be a post-operative infection. If that's the case, we need to act swiftly because things can deteriorate rapidly." As they waited for more information, the all-consuming fear they had previously experienced during Lincoln's illness returned. After the surgery, Callan held tightly onto Mark, her tears flowing down her cheeks as she whispered, "We just got her home. We can't lose her now." Mark responded by squeezing her tighter, his jaw clenched in determination as he said, "She's stronger than this," even though his voice revealed the fear after the surgery. Callan held onto Mark tightly, tears flowing down her cheeks. "We just got her home," she murmured, filled with despair. "We can't lose her now." Mark responded by tightening his embrace, his jaw clenched in resolve. "She's stronger than this," he assured her, even though his voice revealed his own anxiety. "We'll get through this. We have to." Yet, deep inside, they both realized they were once again facing a situation full of uncertainty and dread. The hospital room was unnaturally quiet, interrupted only by the steady beeping of monitors linked to Lincoln's small and delicate form. Mark and Callan sat beside her crib, their faces pale and haggard. Lincoln's fever persisted, and her fragile body seemed almost engulfed by the maze of tubes and wires that were keeping her alive. Dr. Adams walked into the room, holding a clipboard, but his usually calm demeanor displayed a slight hint of urgency. "The tests have confirmed our fears," he said, looking at the tired parents. "Lincoln has developed a post-operative infection at the incision site. It has spread to her bloodstream, resulting in sepsis." Callan gasped, her hand instinctively flying to her mouth as tears filled her eyes. Mark quickly took her other hand in his, gripping it firmly as if to share his strength with her. "What does this mean?" Mark asked, his voice shaking. "What are her chances of recovery?" Dr. Adams paused before responding, knowing the gravity of the situation. "Sepsis in infants is extremely serious," he explained. "It's a race against time. We've already started antibiotics to combat the infection and will be monitoring her closely, but the next 48 hours will be critical." The weight of his words felt like a heavy burden on Callan, making her feel as if the ground had been ripped out from under her. As Mark watched in distress, he felt compelled to inquire about how they could assist Lincoln during her difficult time. Dr. Adams offered a slight reassuring nod, indicating that their presence and conversations were already providing support that was more significant than they realized. Time seemed to stretch interminably as Cal and Mark kept a close watch over Lincoln, with Cal tenderly stroking her daughter's hand and softly whispering encouraging words, reminding her of her strength and urging her to keep fighting through this challenge. Meanwhile, Mark stood by the window, looking out into the dark night sky, fists clenched in anxiety. He had always considered himself an optimist, a believer in miracles, but now doubt began to seep into his mind. He questioned whether the situation might be too overwhelming, feeling a sharp pang of guilt for even letting such thoughts cross his mind. When a nurse entered the room to check on Lincoln's vitals, Cal monitored her movements closely, hoping for any signs of positive or negative news. The nurse informed them that Lincoln's heart rate was stable while offering a small smile, which Cal seized upon as a glimmer of hope. However, as the hours dragged on, the weight of stress and exhaustion became increasingly evident. Eventually, Mark persuaded Cal to take a brief break, assuring her that he would notify her immediately if there were any changes. Reluctantly, Cal left the room and found herself in the hospital chapel. The dimly lit space was devoid of people, the silence occasionally broken by the soft hum of the air conditioning. Overwhelmed, she knelt down, clasped her hands together, and let her tears flow freely. Tears streamed freely down her cheeks as she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion, "I don't know what to do. I've tried my best to remain strong, but I'm overwhelmed with fear. Please don't take her away from us. We've fought so hard for her. She deserves a chance." When Cal returned to the room, Mark welcomed her with a weary yet optimistic smile. "Her fever has decreased a bit," he informed her. "It's not much, but it's certainly a step in the right direction." Kin hurried to Lincoln's side, gently placing her hand on her daughter's forehead. The intense heat that had enveloped her small body was starting to diminish, and for the first time in hours, Cal felt a glimmer of hope. "She's really putting up a fight," Cal said softly, her voice filled with admiration. Soon after, Dr. Adams walked in, his face a mix of caution and encouragement. "The antibiotics are beginning to take effect," he reported. "Although she's not completely out of danger yet, this is definitely a positive development." Mark and Cal exchanged relieved glances, fully aware that their battle was far from over. But even this small success felt monumental to them. That night, they took turns trying to rest in the uncomfortable hospital chairs, determined to stay by Lincoln's side without leaving her alone for even a second. Just as hope began to blossom within them, disaster struck early the following morning. Suddenly, alarms blared from Lincoln's monitors, and medical staff hurried into the room with assured determination that contrasted sharply with the urgent nature of the situation. Mark and Cal were quickly ushered into the hallway, their protests lost amidst the chaos inside. "What's happening?" Cal cried out, gripping Mark's arm tightly as tears streamed down her face. "Why are they taking her away from us?" Mark wrapped his arms around her, his own tears falling silently as he struggled to find words. "I don't know," he whispered, his voice breaking under the weight of uncertainty, "but we have to place our trust in them." The couple experienced what seemed like an eternity filled with anxiety as they awaited news. Each passing second intensified their dread. Finally, Dr. Adams appeared, his demeanor serious. Lincoln's heart momentarily halted in fear when he delivered the news. They had managed to bring her back, but she was in a dire state, with her infection causing her organs to fail. Kane felt her legs buckle beneath her, collapsing onto the floor and crying inconsolably. Mark knelt beside her, his face marked by distress, desperately imploring the doctor for more options. His voice was strained from emotion. Dr. Adams paused briefly before shaking his head in resignation. "We have exhausted all possibilities," he stated gently. "Now it is up to her." Hours later, the couple was permitted to re-enter the room where Lincoln lay motionless, her chest rising and falling thanks to a ventilator. Kane took hold of her daughter's tiny hand, tears streaming down her cheeks and landing on the fragile fingers. "Hi, baby," she whispered tenderly, Mommy's here." On the other side, Mark rested his hand lightly on Lincoln's small foot, softly expressing their pride. "You're the bravest girl in the world." Dr. Adams approached them quietly, his tone empathetic. "We will support any choice you wish to make," he said. "If you want us to continue, we will. However, if you believe it's time to let her go, we can ensure she is comfortable." Those words struck Kane like a physical blow. How could she even contemplate allowing her daughter to slip away after such a fierce battle to keep her alive? Yet, gazing at Lincoln's tiny, fragile form revealed not just her struggle, but also the agony within her body. Turning to Mark, Kane's voice trembled as she spoke. "I don't want her to suffer anymore." Mark, tears flowing down his face, nodded in agreement, saying, "Neither do I." With heavy hearts, they faced the difficult decision ahead of them. In a heartbreaking moment, they decided to take Lincoln off the ventilator. Holding her close, they softly spoke words of love and comfort as they noticed her breathing beginning to slow. "You can rest now, sweet girl," Callan whispered gently, expressing their eternal affection for her. Lincoln's small chest rose and fell one final time before she peacefully drifted away in her parents' embrace. The departure of Lincoln created an immense void that felt impossible to fill. Callan and Mark supported each other, their shared sorrow acting as both a heavy burden and a vital lifeline. In the days that followed, they sought solace in the cherished memories of their daughter. 46 minutes and 1 second. As they stood together in the hospital garden, holding each other tightly, Callan reflected, "She taught us so much during her brief time with us about love, courage, and hope." Mark kissed her forehead, his voice calm despite the tears welling up in his eyes, assuring her that they would always carry those important lessons within them. The days after Lincoln's death felt like a haze for Mark and Colleen. Time appeared to stretch infinitely, with hours melding into one another as they grappled with the profound emptiness left by their daughter. The nursery, which had once been a symbol of hope and joyful anticipation, now served as a painful reminder of their loss. Callan found it too difficult to step inside the room. The sight of the pink walls and the mobile that Mark had carefully made felt like a fresh wound reopening every time she looked at it. She often curled up on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, staring blankly at the television without truly engaging with what was playing. Meanwhile, Mark attempted to keep himself occupied by tackling household chores and errands with a robotic precision, but the pervasive silence in the home was overwhelming. One evening, in the midst of a heavy silence that hung in the air, Callan finally spoke up. With a soft voice that struggled to rise above the low buzz of the television, she confessed, "I don't know how to do this." She avoided making eye contact with Mark, her gaze glued to the flickering screen. "I don't know how to live without her," she added, the weight of her words palpable. Mark gently placed his cup of tea down and moved closer to her, taking a seat by her side. "Neither do I," he responded, his throat tight with emotion. "But we have to figure out a way to keep going." As tears filled Callan's eyes, she turned to look at him. "I feel like I failed her, Mark. I couldn't save her." Hearing the anguish in her voice shattered Mark's heart. He reached out, taking her hand and giving it a reassuring squeeze. "You didn't fail her, Callan. You gave her a chance. You loved her with all your heart. That isn't failure. It's the greatest gift we could have given her." Callan nodded, though the guilt still weighed heavily on her. "I just miss her so much," she whispered. "So do I," Mark replied, his voice trembling. In the weeks that followed, both Mark and Callan leaned on each other for support as they tried to work through their grief. They often talked about her, reminiscing and sharing cherished memories. In their journey of navigating grief, they shared bittersweet moments as they remembered the brief yet impactful life of their child. They found themselves laughing amidst tears when they reminisced about her first joyful giggle, and how she would grasp their fingers tightly with her delicate little hands. Despite her frail condition, she demonstrated incredible strength that left a lasting impression on them. Kin discovered comfort in the act of writing. She began a journal dedicated to her thoughts and feelings, filling it with heartfelt letters addressed to Lincoln. "It feels like I'm still communicating with her," she confided to Mark one evening while penning in the journal, expressing her belief that their child was still present in their lives in some form. Meanwhile, Mark sought solace in tending to their garden, which became a sanctuary for contemplation and recovery. He planted vibrant flowers in honor of Lincoln, selecting bright and cheerful varieties that reminded him of her radiant smile. One day, as they stood together in the garden, he remarked, "She would have cherished these," to which Kin responded with a nod, tears welling in her eyes, affirming his sentiment with, "She certainly would have." One morning, Kin awoke with a newfound determination that had eluded her for weeks. She made her way to the nursery, pausing briefly before opening the door. The room remained untouched, just as they had left it, with the crib perfectly arranged and the stuffed animals neatly positioned on the shelves. A lump formed in her throat as she took in the familiar sight. As Mark entered the room, he discovered Callan seated in a rocking chair, wrapped in one of Lincoln's blankets. He settled on the floor next to her and placed his hand gently on her knee. "Are you all right?" he inquired softly. Callan replied, uncertain, "I don't know, but I think I'm beginning to feel ready to say goodbye." Together, they faced the challenging task of sorting through Lincoln's belongings. This process was not about erasing her from their lives. Rather, it was about learning how to move forward while continuing to honor her memory. They decided to keep several meaningful items: the blanket Callan had been using, the mobile that Mark created, and a small pair of shoes that Lincoln would never wear. As they grappled with their sorrow, Mark and Callan found solace from unexpected sources. Friends and family rallied around them, providing comforting words, home-cooked meals, and attentive listening. Callan's mother, who had been a pillar of support throughout Lincoln's journey, became her most trusted confidant. One afternoon, while sitting together on the porch, her mother reassured her, "It's perfectly okay to feel shattered right now, but remember, you're not by yourself. We're here for you." Mark also drew comfort from the support group he had joined during Callan's pregnancy. He began attending meetings more frequently, sharing Lincoln's story with others who had endured similar losses. After one meeting, he expressed to Callan, "Talking about her keeps her memory alive. It helps me remember that she mattered, that her existence had significance." As time went on, Mark and Callan found ways to transform their grief into something impactful. Callan started a blog to document their experiences, connecting with other parents facing comparable hardships. Her transparency and openness struck a chord with many, creating a sense of community among those navigating similar paths. Many readers reached out to express their gratitude towards her for instilling hope in them. Callan mentioned that if sharing their experiences can positively impact even a single family, then Lincoln's existence will have made a significant difference. Meanwhile, Mark took it upon himself to advocate for greater awareness and research regarding encephalocele. He formed partnerships with local organizations to gather funds for families affected by this condition, participating in events and telling Lincoln's story. "Although she is no longer with us," he remarked during one of his speeches, "her legacy continues through every life we can assist." One evening, while they were spending time together in the garden, Kin turned to Mark with an uncertain look on her face. "Do you ever think about trying again?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Mark met her gaze, feeling a deep sorrow at the openness reflected in her eyes. "I do think about it," he confessed, "but I also consider how frightening it is." "I feel the same way," Kin replied, her voice shaking, "but I don't want our fear to prevent us from moving forward. Lincoln taught us invaluable lessons about love and resilience. Perhaps we are meant to give it another shot." Mark reached out and held her hand, their fingers interlocking. "Let's take things slowly, step by step," he advised, adding that whatever challenges may come, they would confront them as a united front. Sitting together in the garden, with the sun slowly descending below the horizon, Mark and Callan found a sense of tranquility that had eluded them for many months. Although the sorrow of losing Lincoln would forever linger, they had discovered how to bear it, allowing it to influence their lives and the love they shared. "Do you think she's looking out for us?" Callan inquired softly while staring up at the sky. "I'm certain she is," Mark answered confidently, emphasizing that he believed she would want them to continue living, loving, and nurturing hope. The garden surrounding them radiated warmth in the dimming light, symbolizing the life they had cultivated in memory of Lincoln. As the initial stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, they recognized that their journey was ongoing. However, for the first time in a long while, they felt equipped to tackle whatever lay ahead, side by side. Months had elapsed since Lincoln's departure, yet her spirit remained profoundly present in every aspect of Mark and Callan's existence. The once vibrant pink nursery had been reimagined into a serene space for reflection, serving as a poignant reminder of both the joy and agony they had endured. The garden they nurtured in her honor thrived, evolving into a refuge where they could derive comfort and resilience. While their grief persisted, it began to transform, evolving from an overwhelming burden into a gentle, constant presence. Mark and Callan had begun to consider what the future might hold for them, and despite the uncertainty that lay ahead, they were resolute in their commitment to navigate it together. One morning, Callan opened her email and noticed a message that instantly intrigued her. It was from Lisa, the mother whose story had impacted them deeply. Callan felt a surge of emotion as she opened the email that began, "Dear Callan and Mark." The sender had been following their story through the blog they maintained, expressing how much their openness and bravery touched her and many others. She acknowledged the profound pain of losing a child, but also recognized that the love for those children remains eternal. Callan's strength and affection for Lincoln served as an inspiration to her. Lisa offered her support, saying she was available if Callan ever wanted to converse. As Callan read these heartfelt words, tears welled up in her eyes. She decided to share Lisa's message by forwarding it. In an email exchange with Mark, who responded almost immediately, Callan reflected on how Lincoln's story was already making a positive impact on people's lives. That same evening, while they were together in the garden, Callan cautiously broached the topic of their efforts to commemorate Lincoln's memory. Mark faced her, considering her words carefully, and replied that he believed they were doing what they could. However, he expressed his willingness to explore additional ways to honor Lincoln if there were any. Callan nodded in agreement and shared her idea of establishing a foundation aimed at helping other families who are experiencing similar challenges with rare medical conditions. She felt this initiative would be a fitting tribute to Lincoln's legacy. Mark beamed with pride at her suggestion, affirming that it was a wonderful concept. In the subsequent weeks, Callan and Mark dedicated themselves to launching the Lincoln Foundation, a non-profit organization focused on offering resources and assistance to families dealing with rare health issues. They tirelessly reached out to healthcare professionals, hospitals, and other parents to gather advice and build relationships. Their foundation gained momentum quickly, bolstered by Callan's blog and Mark's advocacy efforts. They organized events, developed educational materials, and collaborated with local hospitals to create care packages for families in neonatal intensive care units, NICUs. Every small achievement felt like progress, serving as a way to transform their sorrow into something significant. At one of their initial events, Callan delivered a heartfelt speech about Lincoln's life and the important lessons she imparted to them. Standing in front of a group of parents and supporters, Callan spoke with calm yet powerful determination. She acknowledged that although Lincoln was only with them for a brief period, her influence would endure indefinitely. She emphasized that Lincoln taught them invaluable lessons about love. The passage discusses resilience and the significance of persistence, focusing on a foundation created to honor Lincoln's memory while providing hope to other families facing challenges. As Callan felt a renewed sense of peace during a moment of applause, she began to believe that sharing Lincoln's story could truly impact others positively. The relationship between Mark and Callan deepened as they worked together to create something meaningful, spending long nights brainstorming, reminiscing about Lincoln, and supporting each other through tough times. One evening, while discussing plans for an upcoming fundraiser at the kitchen table, Callan expressed her belief that Lincoln would be proud of their efforts. Mark affirmed her feelings by taking her hand, acknowledging their shared purpose. However, this work also prompted discussions about their future, particularly the unspoken concern regarding the possibility of having another child. One quiet afternoon, Callan tended to the garden flowers planted in memory of Lincoln, reflecting on the thought of expanding their family. Later that evening, while relaxing on the porch, she finally brought up the idea of trying for another child. Mark took a moment before responding. He confided that while he did think about it, it also filled him with fear. What if the painful experience we went through resurfaces again? Kin nodded, recognizing Mark's anxiety. That thought frightens me as well, she admitted. However, I reflect on what Lincoln taught us about love and resilience. Perhaps, despite the fear, it's a risk worth taking. Mark turned to her, contemplating her words carefully. If we decide to pursue this, he said deliberately, we will do it as a team, regardless of the outcome. Kin managed a smile through her tears, agreeing with a sense of cautious optimism. Mark and Kin began to consider the possibility of trying for another child. They sought advice from medical professionals to understand the potential risks involved and how they could minimize them effectively. This was a precarious situation, navigating between hope and fear, yet they were committed to facing it with open hearts and realistic viewpoints. As they ventured into this new phase of their lives, they continued to honor Lincoln's memory by being active in the foundation. They established and incorporating her spirit into their daily routines. One evening in the garden, Kin looked at Mark and said with a smile, regardless of what happens next, I feel her presence in the flowers, in our work, and in everything we do. Mark nodded and pulled her close, reassuring her. She will always be a part of us, he responded. Whatever lies ahead, we will confront it together. Although the future remained unpredictable, Mark and Kin drew strength from one another and the love they held for Lincoln. Her brief life had profoundly impacted them, instilling values of resilience, compassion, and hope. As they contemplated the road ahead, they understood that they would face whatever challenges came their way united. They were determined to honor her legacy, taking it one step at a time. The choice to have another child brought a mix of emotions for Mark and Callan. Hope and fear intertwined, creating a constant internal struggle as they began this new phase of their lives. Although they had consulted medical professionals and taken every precaution possible, the uncertainty of what was to come loomed over them. Callan started journaling again, similar to what she had done during her pregnancy with Lincoln. This time, however, her entries blended cautious hopefulness with reflections on their journey thus far. I'm frightened, she wrote one evening, pouring her feelings onto the page, but I also sense a flicker of hope, like a light piercing through the shadows. I'm unsure of where this road will take me, but I'm prepared to embark on the first step. As weeks turned into months, Callan and Mark found themselves navigating between excitement and worry. Her regular doctor appointments were filled with both relief and unease. Every scan and test brought the chance of news that could either comfort them or break their spirits. One morning, as Callan waited in her doctor's office, she clutched a small bracelet she had worn since losing Lincoln. It was inscribed with the words, "Forever in our hearts," and she found solace in tracing the letters with her fingers. When her name was finally called, she felt butterflies in her stomach from nervousness. Mark, who had taken off work to support her, held her hand tightly as they entered the examination room together. Dr. Patel welcomed them with a warm smile, providing a calming presence amidst their emotional turmoil. As the ultrasound technician initiated the scan, a flurry of emotion swept through the room, which quickly fell into an anxious silence. The images began to appear on the screen, and Callan held her breath, her gaze locked onto the monitor. After a brief moment, the technician beamed with a smile and reassured them, saying that everything appeared normal and the baby was developing as expected. A wave of relief surged through Callan and Mark, allowing their previously tense nerves to start relaxing for the first time in weeks. They finally permitted themselves to exhale. "Thank you," Callan whispered, her voice quivering with appreciation while they prepared for the arrival of their new child. In anticipation of their new baby, Ken and Mark found themselves reminiscing about Lincoln more often. The garden they had nurtured in Lincoln's memory became an integral part of their daily routine. They frequently spent quiet evenings there, tending to the blooming flowers and reflecting on how much they had progressed. One day, while resting on a garden bench, Ken turned to Mark with a contemplative look and asked, "Do you think this new baby will feel like they are living in Lincoln's shadow? What if they grow up believing they need to fill a void that isn't theirs to fill?" Mark took a moment to ponder her question before replying, "I believe it's our responsibility to ensure that doesn't happen. Lincoln will always hold a special place in our family, but this baby should have the opportunity to create their narrative and have space to flourish and receive love for who they truly are." Ken nodded, feeling some of the guilt that had been troubling her begin to dissipate. "You're right," she affirmed. "We'll make certain they understand how deeply they are cherished, just as we did with Lincoln." As they neared the second trimester, Callan started experiencing sharp pains in her lower abdomen, though initially, she brushed them off. Initially, Callan thought the discomfort she was experiencing during her pregnancy was typical. However, as the pain became more severe, she started to feel anxious. Mark, noticing her distress, insisted they go to the hospital, his worry evident in how tightly he held her hand throughout the car ride. Upon arrival at the hospital, the medical team conducted several examinations. Dr. Patel, who had been responsible for monitoring Callan's health, delivered the news with sensitivity yet clarity. She was facing a condition known as threatened miscarriage. She explained that while there was a danger involved, careful observation and plenty of rest could help support the pregnancy. This information struck Callan like a hard blow, causing her to grip Mark's hand tightly as fear surged through her thoughts. "What can we do?" she asked, her voice shaky with anxiety. Dr. Patel placed a comforting hand on her shoulder and advised her that the most important thing right now was to take it easy. She should reduce stress, stay well hydrated, and allow the medical team to manage her care. After receiving this news, Mark and Callan returned home, feeling the heavy burden of their situation. Following the doctor's advice, Callan spent the majority of her time either resting on the couch or lying in bed, while Mark took on all household responsibilities, including cooking and managing their foundation, allowing Callan to concentrate solely on her health. Despite their proactive approach, an underlying fear continued to haunt them. Callan found herself stuck in a cycle of worrying about the worst possible outcomes, her heart filled with sorrow at the thought of potentially losing another child. Meanwhile, Mark shared in her fears but remained determined not to let anxiety overwhelm them. He continually reminded Callan of Lincoln's resilience, recalling the valuable lessons they had learned from her, and emphasized their strength in facing even the most challenging circumstances together. Weeks later, Callan attended a follow-up appointment, and as the ultrasound technician began the examination, Callan prepared herself for what was to come, bracing for any news. Callan had prepared herself for the worst possible outcome, but to her surprise and relief, the technician greeted them with a smile, saying that the baby was doing wonderfully. The strong heartbeat and consistent growth assured them that they had made it through the most critical phase of the pregnancy. With a shaky exhale, Callan felt tears of joy streaming down her face, while Mark squeezed her hand tightly, his eyes shimmering with emotion. "We're going to be okay," he whispered, including their unborn child in the reassurance. As they exited the hospital, Callan experienced a revitalized sense of hope. Although they still had a long way to go, she allowed herself to envision a future filled with brighter days ahead. "This baby is already teaching us so much," she remarked to Mark as they walked toward their car, recalling how their first child, Lincoln, had helped them confront their fears. With their anxiety temporarily alleviated, Callan and Mark turned their focus towards preparing for the arrival of their new baby. They decided to revamp the nursery, once again painting the walls in gentle, neutral tones, adding fresh furniture and decorations. Every single detail was meticulously chosen, representing their love and optimism for what was to come. As they collaborated on this project, Callan felt a sense of healing. The nursery, which had previously been a reminder of pain, now symbolized a hopeful new beginning. "This feels different this time," she said to Mark while hanging curtains by the window. "It's like we're creating something new, not merely attempting to fill the void left by our loss." Mark agreed, resting his hand gently on her shoulder. "Exactly, we are," he responded. "This baby is a unique individual, and they will have their own story to tell." As Callan entered her third trimester, both she and Mark began to embrace a careful sense of tranquility. The baby continued to grow, and each kick and movement brought them immense joy. Even though the fear of uncertainty still lingered in the background, it no longer dominated their feelings of hope. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, in the garden, Callan gently placed Mark's hand on her belly, and they both felt the baby move, an unmistakable and powerful sign of life developing within her. "Can you feel that?" she asked, her voice filled with wonder. Mark smiled broadly, his eyes sparkling with excitement. "Yes, I can feel it. It's incredible," he replied. Callan leaned her head against his shoulder, a gentle smile gracing her face. "I believe Lincoln would be proud of us," she said, expressing her thoughts. Mark tenderly kissed the top of her head, affirming, "I know she would be." As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, their brightness mirrored the quiet optimism taking root in both Mark and Callan's hearts. Although their journey was still ongoing, they felt prepared to confront whatever challenges lay ahead, standing united. With the final weeks of Callan's pregnancy drawing near, there was an undeniable sense of excitement filling their home. The nursery was all set up, the hospital bag was fully packed, and both Mark and Callan were feeling cautiously hopeful. Every kick from the baby and each rhythmic heartbeat they heard during doctor visits felt like a precious gift. However, the memory of Lincoln remained a constant presence, not as a source of grief, but rather as a poignant reminder of the journey that had led them to this moment. On the night before Kane's planned C-section, the couple found themselves sitting together in the nursery. The room was softly lit by a lamp, creating a warm atmosphere. Kane gently traced her fingers along the edge of the crib, her mind filled with a whirlwind of emotions, both excitement and apprehension. "Do you think we're ready for this?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Mark was seated next to her, his hand resting reassuringly on her knee. "We weren't ready for Lincoln," he replied with a comforting tone, "but we loved her with all our hearts. And I believe we'll do the same for this baby. That's what truly matters." Kane nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I just want them to understand how much they are loved." "They will," Mark assured her confidently, "from the moment they take their first breath." The following morning, as Kane prepared for surgery, the hospital buzzed with activity. The familiar smells of antiseptic, the harsh brightness of the lights, and the constant beeping of monitors brought back memories of Lincoln's birth. As they wheeled her into the operating room, Kane clutched Mark's hand tightly. "I'm scared," she confessed, her voice shaking. Leaning down so his forehead touched hers, Mark said softly, "Me too, but we can handle this together, and no matter what happens." As the surgery commenced, I remained by Callan's side. The time seemed to stretch endlessly, feeling like hours instead of mere minutes. Finally, at 10:43 a.m., the moment we had been eagerly anticipating arrived. The room was filled with the unmistakable sound of a robust baby's cry. Callan gasped as the nurse held their newborn aloft, declaring with joy, "It's a boy!" Overcome with emotion, Callan sobbed in relief when the nurse gently placed the infant on her chest. The tiny baby waved his little fists energetically while letting out strong, persistent cries. "Hello, sweet boy," Callan whispered through her tears, which flowed freely as she embraced this long-awaited moment. Mark stood beside her, tears welling in his eyes as he pressed a tender kiss on her forehead. "He's perfect," he murmured softly, completely enchanted by the newborn. Back at their home, they faced nights filled with little sleep and an endless cycle of diaper changes, but neither Mark nor Callan would have chosen any different path. They decided to name their son Miles, a name that represented the extensive journey they had undertaken to arrive at this joyful moment. Miles brought an unparalleled sense of healing into their lives. His laughter echoed throughout their home, filling it with happiness, and his inquisitive gaze reminded them of the beauty found in even the smallest everyday experiences. Often, Callan found herself sitting in wonder, cherishing the little things that made life so meaningful. In the garden, Mark pointed out the flowers they had planted in memory of Lincoln. He reflected on how much his older sister would have adored Miles, gently conveying this thought aloud. She was the one who had instilled in them the capacity to love even before Miles came into their lives. Mark found solace in nurturing their expanding family, frequently carrying Miles around the house while recounting their daily experiences as though his little boy could grasp everything he was saying. "We're doing all right, little guy," he would say, beaming down at Miles, attributing their well-being both to him and to Lincoln. As Miles matured, both Kin and Mark remained dedicated to their efforts with the Lincoln Foundation. To commemorate what would have been Lincoln's second birthday, they organized a memorial event aimed at honoring her memory. This occasion attracted families from all over the community, each bringing their own narratives of grief and perseverance. Standing in front of the audience, Kin spoke with a composed strength that took her many months to cultivate. She expressed that although Lincoln's time with them was brief, it was filled with profound love, stating that her memory has motivated them to assist others during their darkest times. "We are so thankful for the opportunity to share her legacy with every one of you," she concluded. Following the event, Mark and Kin spent time together in the garden, observing as Miles wobbled through the grass. "She would have loved this," Mark remarked, his voice thick with emotion. Kin smiled, placing her hand on his, and reassured him, "She's present in everything we do and in every moment of happiness." As they adapted to their new life with Miles, Kin and Mark started contemplating their future. One night, as they were putting Miles to bed, Kin turned to Mark, her smile tentative, and asked if he ever considered having another child. Mark lifted an eyebrow, a grin beginning to spread across his face. "Are you saying that this little one isn't sufficient for you?" he joked, pointing at their peacefully sleeping son. Callan chuckled softly in response, stating that their child was more than sufficient, but she had been contemplating the idea that perhaps their family had room for more growth. Mark pondered her thoughts, his face reflecting a deep contemplation. He eventually replied, "I believe that whatever choices we make, we'll navigate them together, just as we always have." Callan leaned against him, her heart brimming with affection, and she concurred with his sentiment. As weeks turned into months, Callan and Mark continued to cultivate a life rich in love, hope, and resilience. They recognized that while the marks of their past would always linger, they had learned to bear them with dignity, allowing those experiences to influence but not dictate their future. One sunny afternoon, while they played with their son Miles in the garden, Callan turned to Mark with a smile and remarked on how far they had come, expressing that it felt like they were only beginning their journey. Mark nodded, his eyes filled with quiet resolve, affirming, "Because we are, and regardless of what lies ahead, we can handle it." Bathed in sunlight, surrounded by the vibrant flowers of Lincoln's garden, and amidst the joyful laughter of their son, both Mark and Callan experienced a tranquility they had previously thought unattainable. Although the path before them remained unwritten, they felt eager and hopeful about what the future held for them. The narrative of Mark and Callan transcended mere loss. It was a testament to deep love and unwavering hope. The memory of Lincoln served as a source of inspiration, illuminating their journey. As they gazed toward the horizon, they understood one undeniable truth: their family story was still unfolding. This tale encapsulates not just grief and sorrow, but also an abundance of love. The journey of Mark and Callan showcases the themes of resilience and the unbreakable connection of family. Their experiences demonstrate that, even when confronted with extreme suffering, there is always a possibility for hope and healing. Their remarkable strength serves as a reminder for us to value every single moment, stand up for what we cherish, and seek out positivity even during our darkest hours. We appreciate you joining us on this profoundly emotional journey. If their story resonated with you, inspired you, or provided you with hope, we encourage you to subscribe to our channel. Together, we will keep sharing narratives that resonate deeply and highlight the incredible strength of love and determination.